Hello, welcome back to the Genius PT project. This is project 3C, part 2. If that's not too complex for you, it means we're really just talking about the patient narrative and the patient perspective. Remember, our goal on the Genius PT project is to just make the complex simpler by providing mini classes looking at some complex topics within a biopsychosocial framework. So we have Joletta Belton with us again for this project, talking about the patient perspective. We've had, as part of this mini class, also two patients who were very kind and vulnerable to share their stories with us, talking about their perspective on both traversing their journey in pain from a biomedical perspective and then a biopsychosocial perspective, and what difference that made for them. And so Joletta is a patient advocate. She is also a persistent pain sufferer herself, who has gone through much of this journey and has a lot of wisdom to share. We had a great time talking with her on the last session, and so we thought we would invite her back again before we open it up to a question and answer session period, which will be the next one that we do in a couple of weeks. We thought we would bring Joletta back to talk about the co-creation of the narrative. And that's something she left us with last time. And I'm just curious. I mean, I can imagine what that means, Joletta, but I'm not sure I've heard that term before. So do you want to just dive in and talk to us a little bit about what you mean by the co-creation of the narrative, the patient's narrative?
That'd be great. So, and hopefully I'll do it justice, because these are ideas that I have gotten from other people and kind of brought them together as I was making sense of my own experience and in reflecting back and seeing kind of what helped along the way. So this actually came out when I was writing a chapter for the second volume of Meanings of Pain, which is going to come out later this year, where I had to explore the meanings of my pain experience over time. So that really helped me dive into, like, what were those stories that I was telling myself along the way about what my pain was. And initially, it was very damage-based notions of pain. Very much like that biomedical kind of framework, that it had to be something wrong structurally or there had to be something wrong biomechanically. So that was the narrative that I was telling myself. And I think that's a common narrative that a lot of people come to care with. What I've kind of seen is when patients go in to seek care, then it's almost like in that rush to fix, they're just handed a new narrative. No, this is what your pain is, without really acknowledging what the patient's story is and what their understanding of their pain is, and how they got to that understanding. And that co-creation bit is, rather than just replacing that narrative with a new one or trying to get them on board with what the clinician thinks the pain is or what the path forward is, that they work together from both those perspectives, both those levels of expertise, because the person in pain is coming in with that expertise and their experience and their pain in their lives and what is actually feasible in terms of them moving forward in recovery and rehabilitation. And then the clinical perspective, the clinician brings in their clinical expertise, their knowledge and background and experience in delivering care, their experience with rehabilitation in patients. And a lot of times that clinical narrative is the one that's privileged over the patient's narrative. And that the clinical story, the clinical voice is the one that matters the most. And the patient narrative and the patient story kind of gets pushed aside and is almost seen as superfluous to the whole thing. And that we don't really need to dive into it very much or spend that much time on it. So it's more about bringing that patient narrative up to a level playing field, and then using the expertise of both, that patient, their expertise in their pain, their understanding of things, the clinical expertise of pain itself in general and rehabilitation, and then blending those into a new narrative that makes biological sense, from a science perspective, a clinical perspective, but also biographical sense for that person who is living with pain, that it makes sense within their own story, their own understanding. And that they then have some agency over how they're going to move forward, that it truly becomes more of a shared decision-making process rather than just being told what to do or what this pain is. It's coming to a shared understanding and some shared decisions in determining what that path forward is going to be. Because a lot of times the ideal way forward is not a realistic way forward, and it's never going to be achieved. So how do we get somewhere where good things can happen that are realistic for that person in pain, that they understand, that they can make sense of and make a part of their own story and their own narrative, and that can empower them then to take more more control over how they're going to move forward with this pain experience or their whatever condition they're diagnosed with.
It's interesting because what you're really saying is that the patient is the expert on their pain. And without taking the time to really engage in their story and understand their story from their perspective, we're missing that expertise really in our assessment of what's going on, really, right?
And that missing it is well-intentioned.
Mm-hmm.
It's a desire to help. It's a desire to provide a solution. But in that attempt to fix, to jump in right away, we miss that opportunity to really come to a common ground and a common understanding.
Right.
And I think that in the long term, taking that time up front to do that will actually shorten the time in the long run that rehabilitation takes. There's cool work out there that when patients feel heard and validated, that's what opens the door to them being able to accept new explanations or consider new explanations and explore what those explanations might be. But if they feel like they haven't been heard, then any explanations they get aren't for them, not for their particular condition or story or understanding. It's not about them as a person. It's just this general idea of what pain is, and it can apply to anybody and not necessarily apply to them. So it's so important to take what they're saying, what they understand, and incorporate that into this co-created narrative moving forward. Because it has to make sense for them. It's their lives after all. It's they're the ones that are going home and living with this pain, with this condition. They have to make sense of it in ways that are understandable to them, in ways that they can act on within their capabilities and their resources and all of that.
So go ahead, Susan. Yeah.
I was going to say, I remember in part one of the most empowering things for you when you were working with, I believe it was Peter O'Sullivan. That you had said when you walked away was the fact that you were really able to rediscover and really talk about your story again, and how empowering that was to you. Besides all of the other things that took place, that seemed to be one of the most critical things for you. And I love that perspective because you're bringing that back up again as to the importance of your inner wisdom is as valuable as the clinical inner wisdom.
Yeah. And it truly was such a profound and different experience. Like I said, the last time we talked, no one had ever asked me that before. Just in general, but not in healthcare in particular. And for those that were there, Carolyn, you were there.
Yes,
you can attest to this too. Like, I have never felt listened to so intently. Like, I've never felt so focused on, attended to, cared for, cared about in that exchange, it wasn't even an exchange. It was just me telling my story. And he was just so fully present and never hurried me or rushed me along. And he also never tried to replace anything that I said with a new narrative or what I should believe or what I should understand pain to be. And it just, that being listened to so intently, that in itself is such a therapeutic thing, and it shows that you are of worth and that you're valuable as a human being, and that what you're saying is of value and of worth. And that is important too.
So from an observer's perspective, for that intervention that you had with Peter, he sat right across from you. There was no table between you. Although there was probably 40 or 50 people in the audience listening, he never took his eyes off of you, which was really impressive, right? He just was focused on you and your story. And although he knew that, he was doing this for the benefit of the people who were in the audience, he really ultimately was doing it for your benefit. And I could feel that. I could feel that in the audience. So I can imagine how you felt.
Oh, I absolutely felt that, especially since it went on for 2 hours. If he was doing it for the benefit of the audience, he would have cut that way shorter.
Right. Yeah.
But he allowed for all of this exploration of my story and all of the behavioral experiments and things like that. He just let it all play out and didn't try to cut it off, which I know everyone doesn't have the luxury of being able to do that. But this was also a one-shot thing, the only time I was ever going to see him.
And he didn't have an agenda. He didn't have an agenda, right? He just really let it flow.
Yeah.
Right?
But, and you figure in that, so that was 2 hours long. So it's long for one session. But if you were to break that up over a number of sessions, it's not that long at all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like what we accomplished in that 2 hours could be spread out over visits as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think but yeah, that I think that's so important that you just hit upon, that there was no agenda.
Mm-hmm.
That there wasn't this is how this is going to go, or these are the boxes that I need to check, and what the boxes I need to put her in order for us to move forward. It was just this kind of let the story guide what we're going to do and how we move forward from here.
Yeah, it really was an exploration, right? He really was exploring your story. And again, I can appreciate this whole concept of reconstructing that story. But to do that, you really need to take time to listen first. Yeah. And before you reconstruct, so one of the things that I will often say when I teach is we need to deconstruct before we reconstruct. Right? And so if you don't understand the bits and pieces that maybe have gotten the patient into some trouble, and, you know, sort of look at some beliefs or thoughts or fears or ways that they guard, and you just replace their narrative with, well, this is the way it is, you haven't actually given them an opportunity to learn why it is that way, right? Why the story.
Let them connect their own dots.
Yeah.
And through conversation and dialogue, people will start to come to these conclusions that you are hoping that they'll come to on their own. Mm-hmm. You know, they'll make those connections just by being able to give voice to it and starting to like visualize those things. I thought he made wonderful use at the end of the story when he used the whiteboard to kind of bring everything together, because visualizing things in that way too can really bring home and using all of the patient's language and their understanding, and it not being reframed in the clinical narrative. It's framed in the patient's story, really allows them to take ownership of it, and also take ownership of those things that might help move forward. Like, so for me after that, it was just being able to notice some habits, some habitual postures that I found myself in that we identified during the course of that exchange, and just becoming aware of them and then doing something to change them, you know, relaxing, slumping, doing some very simple things. But it wasn't like I went in and I said this and then someone said, well, you're just very tense and braced, you need to slump and relax. Like if it was just presented in that way, it wouldn't have had the same effect. It was that coming to that shared understanding together, that co-creation of the path forward, that co-creation of a new narrative that was really valuable.
So do you think when a patient says, yeah, but I'm different, my pain is different, right? Do you think that that's a sign for us clinicians to step back and say, they're not feeling heard. They haven't felt that I've actually heard their story, therefore they're not connecting the dots. And I need to step back and listen more.
Yeah, I think that is probably so true. That and but, or that that doesn't apply to me, because that narrative isn't making sense within their concept of what's happening, and they probably don't feel like they've been heard or considered. I think that's spot on. Yeah. What a great way to then pause and be like, okay, like what else? What can we explore? And like, as Maxie Mixiak would say, I'm probably saying her name wrong. Maxie, I'll just call her Maxie. Like, to be able to just hold space then for the story and make some space for it. And then wait for it. She said that at the San Diego Pain Summit this year, which I love, because it's so uncomfortable, like to sit in silence. But if you can just wait it out just a little bit, people will often start talking because it's uncomfortable for them too. Right. And sometimes people are trying to formulate their thoughts too, and then as they're trying to process and formulate what they're going to say, they're not given the opportunity to. They've missed the opportunity because it takes a while to put this stuff together and make sense.
So it's being able to sit still and just listen and be quiet when it is uncomfortable, right? And that's when the magic happens, but that is hard. It is
so hard.
When we're used to being fixers, and have the answer for everything, it's like, oh, okay, I just have to sit and be quiet here and listen and allow them to come up with what the next sort of step might be.
And I might also add, with the stop and being quiet and listening, is to actually turn your judgment self off. And stop saying, okay, I know what they need to do, but I have to sit it out and wait for them to tell their story. Instead, just really listen to the story and wait for the story to unfold, and wait for the clues and the cues of what's so important for the person sitting in front of you. Because it shows, I think, from, your perspective, sitting and telling your story, when somebody is sitting there, but they're not really focused, they're not really focused in. You can tell when somebody is kind of like, okay, they're trying to figure something out or trying to do something. We all have those little bit of, looks on our face and stuff. And the challenge is really to just, as a clinician, to just say, I know I have predisposed judgments, but I'm really going to put those to the side here.
Yeah. And
see if I can really hear this from a different viewpoint or a different perspective.
It's really setting that agenda aside, because it happens so often that you can tell that people are just formulating their response to what you're saying rather than actually listening to what you're saying. And if they're doing that, if they're just coming up with what they're going to say in response, once you're done, they're just waiting for you to finish so they can say what they want to say.
Right.
It's going to be really hard to get any.
Right.
Because then it's just two people waiting to say what they want to say.
Right.
Not listening to the other person.
So almost if the conversation flows too smoothly, then you're not really actively listening, are you?
Yeah.
Right? Because you haven't, if you've really listened, it's going to take a moment to think about, okay, how do I respond to that, right? Whereas if I've got an answer on the tip of my tongue, I've been thinking about that answer the whole time you've been talking, right?
Right.
Hard.
Or maybe even, do I need to respond yet to that? Maybe there's a little bit more that is coming out here, and having that pause, which is unnatural for many people. Kind of, because then if you give it long enough, and then I could, because they're so used to being cut off.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you've told me your story. I pretty much know what to do. Let's go.
When people can be totally thrown, like I was in that session when I was asked to tell him my story, I was like, what do you mean? Like, where do you want me to start? Was my first question. He was like, wherever you want. And I was like, oh, well, I don't know what to do with that. And then even I was surprised at where it went. And that's the fascinating part. I was actually just talking with Keith Meldrum today, because we're actually going to be speaking at the San Diego Pain Summit next year. We're doing a joint thing. So we were talking about what we're going to be doing next year. We were talking about how important it is for even just him and I to have conversations, and how beneficial it's been for us to share our story and to have like these types of interactions, because we learn so much about our own experiences and are able to reflect back on things that we hadn't thought of until it's coming out of our mouths. And then we're like, whoa, where did that come from? And we're people who are pretty, used to doing this now, and still learning so much along the way by just having that agency and that ability to share our story and to have conversations about it. Like that, having a conversation is so, so valuable. And it's so overlooked. Like the art of just having a conversation is not a skill that people are taught when they're in medical school or PT school or whatever, but that it's such a valuable skill to have, to just be able to sit and have a conversation and to be able to facilitate conversations that might be difficult. That's why I love John Lahner's book, A Narrative-Based Practice in Health and Social Care, that he wrote, because it's a slim text, but it's very accessible and like actionable. He's got steps in there of actually how to have these hard conversations, and how to have conversations when there's a language barrier, there's family members in the room, like all of these different things that can kind of throw us off in terms of how we're going to navigate those scenarios. And it's his work and the work of Howard Brody too, who's a bioethicist, that really gave me the language of that co-creation of new narratives. And it just made so much sense to me, putting all of that together. I was like, yes, this is, and looking back, this is what I did. This was the path that I took.
I listened to your wisdom and your experience and what you bring to the patient experience, which is, I think, so valuable because it's been so overlooked. And I reflect back to Louis Gifford's work back in the late 80s, who talked about the most important things you can do with the patient is ask them questions like, what do you think is causing your pain? And what do you think needs to be done about it? And what do you think hasn't been done to this point? And if we could just, I mean, that's now 30 years ago, if we could just take a step back and really listen to the patient, that's where the power is.
And the question of what is it that's really, really, really in your heart of hearts worrying you? Getting to the really important things, because they may be afraid to utter that, like, oh, the deep dark place. I think you called it your dark place, Joletta, on our last one, which was so powerful, listening to your words. But those things, this was part of the culture of coming out of the free love and peace
that's right.
generation, and before we picked up our blankets and went and got jobs, but it is true. It's such a powerful tool, and I wonder too, culturally, I find that different cultures have different abilities or it's just different importance on really sitting and listening and being quiet versus other cultures which want each other to be so happy they just kind of run over each other a little bit. And like, okay, I know what to do, let's go do this stuff, and everybody's happy, and we don't have to hear the dark bad stuff, let's just all be happy.
And I think it's so important that we allow for that depth and breadth of the human experience. We don't live on one end of the spectrum, not any of us. Everyone experiences suffering and pain and grief and loss, and we should be allowed to. And I think it would do just society in general so much good if we could do a better job about having conversations about those hard things. Even about things like aging and dying. We do such a crappy job about talking about these big things, yet it's going to happen to all of us.
Right.
If we're lucky, we're going to age, and all of us are going to die, as far as I know.
We don't get to get out of this world without that piece, right?
We don't have those conversations. It's like pushed into the corner. If we don't talk about it, then it's not going to happen. That's just not reality. But I love that question of like, what really worries you most? Like, what really concerns you the most is really going to clue into where that person's distress lies and what really needs to be addressed. And it might not have anything to do with like a specific symptom or a specific body part. It can be fears for the future, becoming disabled and losing independence. It could be all of these really big things that there might be a different path towards assuaging some of those fears and worries and concerns. And it could lead to figuring out a different problem to solve, rather than the pain being fixed in order to prevent this from happening. What are ways that we can work on this not happening and focusing on something other than just relieving pain to prevent future calamity, it just asking meaningful questions can be such a good way of figuring out what really matters to people. And I can't remember if I shared in the first talk, like what was most concerning to me during those dark years of my pain was not being able to sit. Like that was really the most life-limiting factor of my pain, was just not being able to sit. That meant I couldn't drive. It meant I couldn't go meet friends for coffee or a drink. It meant I couldn't even watch movies with my husband on the couch because I couldn't sit on the couch. It was too painful. I'd have to lie on the floor. I had these prison glasses, like for the bedridden people, so that you could see like a 90-degree angle. That was my most life-limiting factor, and it was never addressed by anyone. And looking back now, like that's the part that like hurts the most, is that like we focused so much on things that were of clinical relevance, my range of motion, the stupid whatever
goniometer.
That thing. And like, I was doing step ups to the treatment table, doing all of these, high functioning things. It's like, yeah, I can do all of this stuff. I will do it all day long. And I like doing this stuff, but I can't freaking sit. And that's the part that is affecting my life the most. Right. I'm not going to get back to work on the fire engine, stepping up to the back, to the tailgate, if I can't even drive to work in the first place.
Yeah. And yet, what we don't think about those most important functional pieces. We think about the tissues and getting the tissues range of motion and strength back, and we look at tissue drivers, but we don't think about the functional pieces and how maybe the sensory motor maps have changed, right?
Yeah.
On the brain, and how we need to maybe address that piece, or how fear or catastrophization is just priming the pump on the pain system, right? So again, looking at that more broadly starts with listening to the patient narrative, right?
And not telling people wrong information. Like, I had a lot of explanations that were very biomechanically focused, and that just reinforces those ideas that there's one right way to move, one right way to sit. Like, I even had my car set up in a way where I was sitting on a wedge to roll my hips forward, and a lumbar pillow and a scapular pillow, all these things to get me in this perfectly upright position and posture. And then I would try to hold that. So no wonder driving was so friggin' painful.
Right.
You know, like, what if I had just been told, like, sit in a way that's most comfortable for right now. If you notice yourself starting to tense up, try and relax. Like, how different an approach that would have been to, you have to maintain this posture while you're driving. And if you don't, that's why you're in pain. And then you're thinking, so I'm still in pain. I'm not holding it quite right enough.
Yeah.
You know, so then you become
I'm
more
doing wrong.
more rigid in those rules surrounding it. And that was never the intention, obviously, of the clinician that set that up for me. But that's where it can go when your pain, when the explanations aren't matching up with your experience.
Well, and when we have a very biomechanical understanding, then we believe that ideal posture is going to get us out of that problem, or moving a certain way. And there's just no or very little evidence that actually connects persistent pain with that biomechanical piece. So we have to stop our narrative as clinicians, right? I mean, talk about co-creating a new narrative. That's going to take some work.
Being able, and that was Peter O'Sullivan that gave me the permission to slouch.
Yes, he did. Yes,
and I'm such a good sloucher now. I'm slouching right now, and I'm pretty damn comfortable. But before that, so that was in 2017. So just 2.5 years ago, I would have been like this, like sitting upright, trying to roll my hips forward, trying to stay still. And now I have permission to slouch, and it's so much more comfortable. and then I change it up.
Right. But then when slouching gets uncomfortable, you do something different. Right. But it's just variability. It's not rules.
To do it all, and that's the beautiful part.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it sounds like what we need to really take away from your discussion from a patient perspective is that the most important thing that we can do as clinicians is give ourselves permission to take time to really listen to the patient's story and to allow them to be the expert of their pain, and to allow us to help them explore what things might change to help them move on their journey towards wellness.
I love that word, explore. I think it's such a good word. And, it made me think when you said, clinicians we need to give ourselves permission. It could also be kind of a behavioral experiment. Like I did with Peter. Like, don't doing this. Do an experiment for 2 weeks. And see what it's like if you use this approach with your patients, and give it a time limit. Give it 2 weeks to see how it goes. You don't have to go all in all at once.
Right.
Just behavior change is hard for all of us.
It is.
Yeah,
we default
all in for sure. But if you're not used to doing this, then start with one.
Yeah.
Then when you get a little bit better with that one, add another one. And like you said, give it a little bit of time. And just because small big changes happen with small increments over time, small steps over time. And I love the clinician give themselves permission, instead of the clinicians aren't intentionally doing anything wrong. They need to it's just a reframing for them as well. And I tell clinicians too that are kind of learning and struggling with this idea, is give yourself a little grace. This is a paradigm shift for you as well, but both of you will benefit. Which is
a little bit of self-compassion. A little bit of self-compassion goes a long way for patients and clinicians alike.
Yeah, for sure. And just allowing yourself to recognize that change is needed. right? That's the first step. I need to change. I have some biases, right? I have some biomechanical biases. I have a framework that is broken, and I need to give myself permission to explore some options.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful parallel, I think.
Do you have any other thoughts or words of wisdom from a patient advocacy perspective? So we're going to have a question and answer session with Joletta in a couple weeks. And what date did we set for that? June 25th? Or sorry, July
24th.
July 24th.
July 24th. Okay, so if you're able to join us, we'll also put all of that out on social media, and hopefully you'll have had a chance to listen to these talks ahead of time so that you can ask Joletta some great questions. But Joletta, do you have any other sort of final words or thoughts from a patient, maybe advocate perspective at this point? So you also do some really strong advocacy work and support work for patients. Where do they go when they're stuck?
Well, one thing I want to say is just I'm grateful for this opportunity to even have these conversations, that the patient voice is being valued and brought into discussions like this. And that gives me such hope, because I think these are such rich and meaningful conversations that can lead to better ways forward for both clinicians and for patients. And so I just want more of it. So my biggest thing is just, let's do more of this, you know, and not just with me, with all other patients around the world and patient voices around the world. For patients who are stuck, the biggest thing I want them to know is that they're not alone. That they're not alone, and that they're believed, and that their pain is real, and that their suffering is real, and that there is hope. There is a way forward for all of us. And it might take some time to figure out what that way forward is, but there's good people out there that can help. And to just not give up on finding what that spark of hope might be. I think that's it. But just, I think having these conversations, including that patient perspective, that patient voice in these conversations, will start to lead to less people being stuck and left behind. Because then we'll really know where the struggles and the problems lie and what we need to be addressing. For all of the researchers out there, anyone who wants more information on patients being involved in research and patient partnering in research, be happy to share resources with them, because I think that's an invaluable thing too. That maybe we could start asking some different questions, initial just research questions, and exploring different ways forward. Because one of the things I ask a lot of clinicians is, have you ever asked your patients, your successful patients, what they thought worked and why it worked? Because it might not be what you thought worked, why it worked.
It's generally never
Brilliant. Yeah.
And I think those things are really important for us to explore. You know, finding out why things don't work for some patients and why they work for others gives us really good insights into different ways forward. So we need to just keep having these conversations in order to keep giving people hope that are stuck.
You know, I think, again, just recognizing that in persistent pain, every individual has their own story, and the sample size in research is N equals 1, right, in persistent pain. And so that's why it's so challenging. But again, you're going to start to hear common themes. You're going to start to be able to put pictures and trends together that will help you to help your patients. But you can't know that trend unless you've stopped and listened to their story, right? And then ask them. I love that. Ask them when they're done. What do you think actually helped you the most, right? That's brilliant, right? Well, thank you so much, Joletta, for, again, spending some time with us and really sharing your perspective and the patient's perspective and the importance of patient advocacy. And we can't thank you enough for the work that you do. So we look forward to July 24th and being able to ask some more challenging questions. And hopefully we have a lot of therapists who join us, and even some patients who would like to join us and ask Joletta about her experiences and some of the wisdom that she's gleaned from those. So thank you again.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you kindly. And we'll see you in a few weeks on the Genius Project with Joletta Belton and question and answers. Thank you, everyone.